Hello, and welcome to the second episode of my Memoirs of a Fellow Traveller, which are reflections on events and experiences that I've had in life. In the light of the wisdom of the Fourth Way tradition, which I talked about, Gurdjieff's Fourth Way, and the wisdom it offers, and the Enneagram, and the symbolic which is a symbolic representation of the three fundamental cosmic laws which have impacted, and I can see how they've been working out in my life now that I understand it a little bit. Well, at the end of the last episode, I was talking about my experiences at school and how I managed to navigate my way through those rather turbulent adolescent years with the help of the guidance of spiritual mentors, if you like, who are very much in the evangelical Christian tradition, and I was therefore molded into that kind of a person, and that certainly helped me to avoid making too much of a mess of myself at that point in life. So anyway, I better continue the story, but I've got a couple of other things to say, I think, first, before I dive into the actual. There are a couple of other points I want to make in reflection as I reach this, looking back at this stage of life. And that is that, of course, in the process of enculturation, I was also being molded into a view of the world that saw the material world as reality, and the spiritual world was very much seen as unreal. But at the same time, I because of my Christian faith, I had a belief, if you like, with some backup of some early experiences of the numinous. I remember looking up at the stars and being full of wonder, for example, at the age of 9, 10 years old. I remember I was looking up at Orion, actually. I can remember it very clearly, and being absolutely filled with wonder at the sort of immensity of this universe in which we lived. And at that time, I still didn't have any idea how large it really was. But anyway, I had this sense, therefore, that there is another dimension, a spiritual dimension, a transcendent dimension, if you like. I wouldn't have called it that as a child, but basically what happened is that all my concept of God was out there. I mean, God was other. And of course we were taught as Christians, the profanity of human flesh, and therefore the sort of looking down upon the physicality of us as human beings and all the normal stuff that we feel as human beings, especially our sexuality as it begins to emerge. And so there was a dichotomy split in my kind of psyche at this point. I tried to find my own answers to this separation. But in the end, basically, practically, you lived your ordinary life in the sort of physical dimension of this world, and the scientific sort of worldview at the time, the dominant worldview, which is now being challenged. It has to be said, it's being challenged by recent discoveries in science and by quantum physics in particular, and the idea of the quantum field, and out of which everything has emerged. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And many people have basically excluded the whole spiritual dimension, and other people, like myself, included it as a separate something else, other. And there wasn't really an integration of the two, and between the two. Now, the second thing I wanted to say, I'm just trying to remember what it was just now. Yes, the other thing I wanted to say at this point was the fact that I've talked about the essence with which we are born. We're unaware of that essence, but and it gets layered over with all this encultured, our enculturation into the culture that we live in, and the worldview it operates in. But in point of fact, the personality, the ego personality, is actually, if you like, a sort of result of these two together. Unconsciously, we don't realize what it is. So the essence part and then the cultural part sort of work together. But what ended up happening, and this is the formation of my personality in the personality Enneagram, which is a number five, a social five, if you want the subgroup, is that I viewed the world as a place of scarcity. Now, there are lots of, and I was particularly susceptible to that because of the way that I've been brought up. So, if you have this particular sort of tendency, if you like, the the real essence is actually non-attachment. That's that's the sort of virtue of the personality. But or rather the way you think about well, non-attachment is indeed the virtue of that personality. But what happens with me was because my father lived very frugally. I had no idea that he was living all the time off his own personal private income from stocks and shares and property that he owned, due to where he was born, a son of the web that developed the Web estate, which is now an extremely expensive place to live in south of Croydon in Purley, with conservation areas and houses that cost millions. But I had no idea. And basically, he lived very true to his ideals, and I admire him for this, in that he gave away an awful lot of his wealth, and so we lived extremely simply. And you'll in the story that I will tell later, you'll find more examples of that and how it impacted me as well. So the result is that the number five personality is a five is the result of somebody who unconsciously views the world as a place of scarcity and therefore is holding on to all the resources you can, I mean, emotionally and not just physically, or financially. Indeed, it's very rarely the financial side. It's actually the other things. So that I tended to run away from any relationship which demanded emotion from me. And the number fives are not very in touch with their emotions. My father was very unemotional and not a demonstrably affectionate person. My mother a little bit more so, but I wasn't brought up in a family that was used to affection, or show demonstrations of affection. So there we are. That impacted me enormously. Well, the other thing I did whilst at school was join. You had to join one of the armed forces. You had to be. So I chose the RAF rather than the Army Cadet Force and Corps, and we had sort of training, and eventually that led to me being applying for a flying scholarship with the RAF, and you go through a rigorous testing procedure, and eventually I was awarded the scholarship. So I learnt to fly. In fact, I got my flying license, and you can see a copy of it on the left here. And there's a bit of a story to tell about my training. But I got my flying license before I got my driving license. Funny enough, I managed to fail my driving license test, I think at least twice, due to silly misunderstandings about what directions. But no, I'll not go into that. But anyway, what happened was that it was the year that I'd finished at school. I was 18, and so I'd done my A levels. And by the time I was awarded this, and they sent me off to train at a flying club in Bristol, what is now the Bristol Airport, but it was just a small little airfield. It had a runway, and obviously some commercial flights as well. But there was a flying club there, and I was trained there on a port. No, it wasn't Port Pilatus. It was the Piper Colt. Well, the very first flight up with my flying instructor, I'd had a tiny bit of experience flying chipmunks for the RAF. I mean, just as not in charge of them, but anyway. So the instructor said, "You have control," from very soon after takeoff, and he just told me what to do. And I landed my very first flight. I landed back, thankfully safely on the ground with a reasonable landing effort because the Piper Colts are very easy to fly. And then the next day, we were told, "I'm sorry that we couldn't continue our training because the instructor that we were there were two of us. The instructor that we had been allocated was under the influence of alcohol while he was instructing us. No wonder he had me in control." And unfortunately, that meant that we would have to be postponed until next year. But there was a cut-off time that I think 18, the year was the oldest they would have us. And so we thought, well, we realized that we would forfeit, therefore, the flying scholarship completely. But thankfully, my friend who was learning with me, his father was in the RAF, some fairly high up position in the RAF, I think. So he phoned his father, who got the great wheels turning, and thanks to his influence, we then ended up at Cranfield in Bedfordshire, and there was the Missionary Aviation Fellowship Training School there. And so I was actually taught by Missionary Aviation Fellowship pilots as part of their training program. And I then had to make a very important decision whether or not I was going to be a pilot with a Missionary Aviation Fellowship or carry on and do my medical degree and be a doctor. And we were discouraged from trying to combine the roles because you would tend to take risks as a pilot because you were a doctor, when you shouldn't be flying in difficult weather circumstances. And so they didn't want you combining the roles. And I eventually decided that being a medical practitioner would give me far more opportunity to serve humanity, if you like. So that's what I did at St Bartholomew's Hospital, which is where I did my medical degree. So after completing my flying training, sufficient to get a private pilot's license, although I wasn't awarded that until 1966. I did my training in 1965, or I think it must have been 66. Anyway, to begin. So I had a bit of a gap, and I went out to Thailand again to visit my parents. But I spent the intervening months. I volunteered to help the professor of microbiology in Chiang Mai University do a research project, which involved me taking blood samples from all tribal people in lots and lots of different remote locations throughout the north of Thailand. The photograph at the top left in black and white is me in Bangkok, I think, as I was probably leaving to come back. But again, because I had my flying, anyway, what happened was I was sent out to these remote tribal villages, but this time using the Air America planes or helicopters, and I was therefore, having got some flying experience, they allowed me to fly, or to at least have control of them, although they always did the takeoff and landing. The landings were quite difficult because they were often in difficult little short landing strips on a mountainous ridge or in a valley, quite tricky to get into. So it required some skill. And here we are just disembarking, or rather a whole group of people waiting, I think, to get on board. So a group of tribal people. So I often spent some time in the tribal villages, and I took lots of photographs. These are very bad copies of slides that I took. And eventually, when I came back, I wrote an article for the Geographic magazine, which was published, but about the hill tribes of North Thailand. But anyway, we had some fun doing that, and sometimes it was involved going with these two tribal labs. Here were Hmong tribes people, and they took me to the tribal villages sometimes. And then when I had collected blood samples, a bulk of my time actually was spent in the lab back in Chiang Mai Medical School, testing it, Vidal testing, for those of you who understand a bit about medicine. When I was staying, it wasn't actually so much in the tribal villages, but usually in the border police outposts. Now, remember, this is during the Vietnam War, so the Air America were the people that were flying me around. They were supporting the border police and all sorts of economic efforts to with amongst the tribal people because they wanted them to not be tempted to go across and join the communists next door in Laos. So anyway, that was their strategy. There's a film made of Air America if you've seen it, a drama film actually. But anyway, the real that was the people I was flying with. Now, one of the things that happened there was that I was expected to know an awful lot about medical stuff, and I didn't know very much, really, just basic first aid and basic understanding of it all. But one day, somebody arrived at the border police station, and it was about 4 o'clock in the evening, so fairly late on in the day. And he said that there was a young mother giving birth to a child, and the arm had been born, but the baby was stuck, and I realised that this was probably a life-threatening situation. So I suggested to the border police that they call a helicopter, which they did, and myself and the young tribal man who brought the message ran back over the ridge to the village, and we had to climb and run as fast as we could, just as well I was fit. Because the time was of the essence, as darkness would be coming soon when the helicopter wouldn't be able to land. So the helicopter saw us on the ridge, picked us up and took us to the village, and that's a picture of the helicopter just there. And the mother was taken on board, and we flew. She was flown to Chiang Rai Hospital, where she was delivered, but sadly the baby died, I think. That's what I heard anyway. The picture below the helicopter is just taken from the helicopter, actually, of the village, but I'm afraid it's such poor quality you can't see the village there. The picture on the right is a picture of a border policeman who sometimes accompanied me on horseback to go and do village visits. Well, when I was 20, in my second year at university, my guardians took me to a Christian conference in Largs in Scotland, and there were just a few of us young people there. And there I met Carol, who was later to become my wife. There was nothing romantic that happened between us at the time. But then I met her again in the summer at another Christian conference. Her parents often took her to, and she was therefore volunteering on the staff then and serving at tables. And I happened to be with a university friend at the table, and we bumped into each other again and began communicating by letter after that. I won't go into the details of the story, but eventually, to cut a long story short, my parents were back in the country at that time, I think, and both our respective parents kind of nudged us, if you like, saying, if you are thinking of getting engaged, I mean, she's the right person. Well, her parents, her mother particularly, was keen that she thought I was the right kind of person for her daughter, because by then I was quite a keen Christian. I mean, I had some spiritual experiences, I guess, experiences of awe, but the commitment had come in my later years at school. And by that time, my guardians were in Bristol. They're not family members. The Bath family, they were to do with another mission called the Rwanda Mission, actually, and they took in a number of missionaries' children and sort of fostered us. And I don't know, I think I made a commitment largely out of the fact that I wanted to belong. And Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity, was the background in which I was reared, and it was very important for evangelical Christianity that you were kind of born again. So you had to kind of make a commitment, and do the ABC: admit your sins, believe in Jesus, and I can't remember what the C is now. Anyway, commit yourself, So I did. And yet I had lacked, I think at that stage was not profoundly impacted in terms of experience. It was very much a sort of intellectual, okay, I've done this sort of thing. So when I went up to university, I also joined the Christian Union there, very active, and I'll tell you a story about that later. But just meanwhile, to carry on the fact that I'd met Carol in the context of the Christian camps, and so our two parents encouraging us each other. And my father said to me one day, by the way, Kenneth, if you're thinking of getting engaged, because he could see what was happening. I hadn't talked about engagement. I hadn't even thought about it. But he said to me, if you're thinking of getting engaged, be prepared for a long engagement, because there was at least another 3 years of my medical studies, and he wasn't particularly keen for me to get married before I qualified. So yeah, we had a long engagement, all right, and most of it was therefore communicated through letter writing, which we did in those days. We didn't have emails. The picture on the right shows my. I was. Oh, the top picture was actually where we got. Actually, I proposed, on the banks of Loch Lomond, no less. And then the picture on the right is my wife with her younger brother and younger sister and a friend. Her brother must have been the one who took the photograph. Her mother sitting in front. I'm standing next to her there at Balsporon Cottages in the Dromochta Pass. And if you're ever up the Dromochta Pass on the road of the A9 road between Perth and, well, Pitlochry and Inverness, you will pass it. It's there to this day. It's now a bed and breakfast. But it was. Well, when I went up to university, I joined the University Christian Union, well, the St Bartholomew's Hospital part of that Christian Union. And whilst in my first and second years, there was this increasing a movement that was gaining momentum throughout the mainstream churches called the Charismatic Movement. And it was a movement that was seeking to recover a far more experiential Christian faith, and emphasizing the fact that we can be immersed in the Spirit and filled with the Spirit, and through being filled with the Spirit, not only do the fruits of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and all the rest of it begin to grow more fully in our lives, but also we are equipped to do God's work in this world, to fulfill our mission in this world, whatever that is, through being equipped by spiritual gifts of various kinds. But the sort of initiation into this was talked of as baptism of the Spirit, following comments made in the Gospels about the way that the promise that Jesus said, you shall be baptized. You've been baptized with water, but not many days hence you'll be baptized with the Holy Spirit. And that, of course, was something that was pointing towards their experience of the Spirit that overtook them on the day of Pentecost. And all that happened then with the sort of the speaking, the gathering that I think took place in the portico of the temple, actually, not in the upper room. This beginning praising God in all these different languages, and the crowd that was visiting for the festival of Pentecost overheard them and gathered around to see what was going on. And Peter then has to explain what's going on. So anyway, that was the sort of that was what was being talked about. But as far as my own personal experience is concerned, I hadn't had this. And indeed, in my school days at the School Christian Union, we'd had speakers warning us against all of this stuff, saying it was of the devil, which was somewhat therefore confusing to me. So anyway, I was hungry. I really longed for a sense of God's real presence, if you like, in my life. And so I began seeking this in quietly and thinking about it. And I continued my practices of prayer, meditation, contemplation, and all the rest of it, Bible study. But one night, I was quite late on in the evening. I suddenly found myself being overtaken. Well, put it this way, it's a bit like what Paul said at one point, I think in his second letter to the Corinthian church, whether in this, I know, he said, I know a man who in Christ, whether was caught up into the third heaven, whether in this body or not, I do not know. Talking about his own experience. And it was a bit like that. And I was so overwhelmed by this experience of complete oneness with the divine reality that I understood as knew as God through Jesus Christ and God the Father and all that. I mean, I had the words in the sort of theory, but it was. I mean, there were no words to describe this at all. It was a complete sense of complete union with ultimate reality. And out of that, I began to want to praise God, just, praise, give thanks, glory. I don't know. Anyway, I ran out of words. I couldn't find the words to express what I was feeling and what I was experiencing. And suddenly I found myself, out of my mouth came words that were not a language. But as soon as I realized that, I stopped myself, because I was fully compos mentis. It wasn't that I was out of control. In fact, later I discovered that if it's not the genuine article, you can be sort of not in control of yourself. But it was one of the hallmarks of the genuine, is that you are fully in control of your what you do and say and everything, even in the midst of this experience. So I then began to say, oh, I just sort of thought, well, okay, I'm going to relax into and let this happen, which I did, and it went on all night. So I woke up in the morning after a short sleep, it must have been, full of energy. But what that experience did for me was to transform me from a very timid, quiet, unconfident follower of Jesus into somebody who had a great confidence that the Jesus way was really the truth. Now, what also, but the way I interpreted that was at the level of my spiritual intelligence at the time, which was still an ethnocentric stage of development. And in fact, I was stuck in that for many, many years, not realizing it even, because I didn't understand these things. And therefore, the result of that was the desire to want to convert everybody to my way of, or to the truth as Christians, particularly the charismatic Christians, taught it and understood it and interpreted it from their reading of scriptures. So I want to reflect on that a little bit more, because in fact what I realized now was happening was in fact the birth of a new creature, if you like. Paul talks about, if anybody is in Christ, he's a new creature, or there is a new creation. The whole of reality is changed. Your whole perception of reality is changed. But this birth was a bit like my own birth, which I talked about earlier in terms of the law of three. You've got three forces giving birth. You have to have three independent but interrelated forces in operation for something new to emerge. And in this case, there was the desire for experiential Christianity, for union with the divine, but there was resistance to the phenomena of speaking in tongues, because I've been warned against it. So that was the second. So there was an active force, there was a passive. There was a passive force, which is, or a desiring force, and a resisting force is the other way you can also think of it. And then when I relaxed my ego, my sort of control, if you like, I relaxed into divine grace and trust, and then everything just flowed. So to illustrate this a bit further, and again, this is a reflection that I didn't understand at the time, and I've only understood many years later. I want to just say a little bit more about this before I move on with the story itself. In his letter to the Christians in Rome, St. Paul talks about the dilemma he had and the experience of wanting to be somebody who does what God's, who is following the right path, doing the right things, living in the right way, um, and yet at the same time finding that there's something that is inside them, which is what he called the flesh, but actually it is actually his term for what we would today call an ego personality, which is unfortunate he used the word flesh, by the way. It really caused all sorts of problems later on in misunderstanding what he was saying. But anyway, when you've only got two forces, you don't go any, you don't get anywhere, you don't make move forward, nothing new can happen. And so you've got in that situation, your divine essence is passive, and the ego personality is active. And the way that Paul expressed it was, with my mind I serve God's law. That's with desire to do what is right. But with my unspiritual nature, which is the way some modern translations translate his term, with my flesh, but I would say with my ego personality, I serve the law of sin, which is basically one's ego passions at work. And this is all you'll find in Romans 7, 15 and 17. And what he discovered is that trying to change under religious law or any other kind of external moral code is not an effective third force. So what is the effective third force? Well, what Paul discovered in his experience is that when he relaxed his ego and let God, if you like, really sort of take control, the divine reality, he relaxed into divine grace. So he discovered that the third force was not religious law, but divine grace, and that is always true. And then when you do that, the actual essence becomes active. So we're given the courage to act so that we can actually move forward in the process of transformation. It's a long process. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a whole lifetime, but the essence becomes far more active when we begin to learn this. And the ego personality becomes the passive force. So resistance, of course, is felt and acknowledged, but not in control. And when we do that, we discover that we are in this new creation, this new world. We relate to everything in a completely different way. And later on, another passage, Paul talks about, if any man is in Christ, he's a new creation. In Christ is a technical term which I won't go and explain now, but it's very different from some of the explanations I gave earlier on about what it meant. One of the responsibilities that I took on in the University Christian Union was that of looking after overseas students who came to study at the university, and we offered them hospitality, friendship, introductions to, doing all the practical things one does in this country, but maybe differently from where they came from. And so I met lots of Thai students while I was there, and many of them said to me, Ken, when you qualify, you should go and work in Thailand, because they knew that my parents were now in Thailand. I had been to Thailand. I'd already got a smattering of the Thai language, or at least I had that background in the Shan language that I spoke about last time. And so, but I resisted this idea because I wasn't wanting just to follow in my father's footsteps. And Thailand for me was almost home. That's where I felt more at home than in the England, actually. So with that sort of resistance, I didn't give them any sort of firm commitment about the idea of going to Thailand. But one day, it was a Saturday night, actually. I had a dream. It was a vision it was a sort of waking dream, I don't know, but it was like a vision. And I saw myself working very vividly, working in a village setting in North Thailand, having a clinic somewhere, which of course, I mean, I'd experienced this before with my father. But the strange thing was that I woke up from this vision feeling a sense of joy and of deep peace and excitement. And that was what was new after that. And then I sort of went back to sleep again. In the morning, I woke up and thought, no, that's just my subconscious working overtime. This isn't anything divine or God's guidance or God trying to speak to me in a dream. Of course, the next day was Sunday. Went to church. I was a member of the All Souls Langham Place Church Choir. It's the one that's outside BBC headquarters in London now. And so after the service, a few of us had been invited by a member of the congregation to lunch. And amongst the other people that he had invited, there was a visitor from Oxford University. Actually, she was a new graduate from Oxford University, and a Thai person, a Thai lady. And she said to me when we were introduced, Ken, I'm so glad you're going to Thailand. I've been praying for you. So she must have heard about me and sort of thought that I should really think about going to Thailand. And so the fact that this came hot on the heels of this experience the night before, and I suddenly realized, goodness me, I better take this seriously. This is God after all. And so I decided to take my pediatric elective, which we were allowed to take at any university in the world that would have us. I decided to apply to do this in the University of Chiang Mai, of course, which I had done some voluntary work in when I was before going up to university. And they accepted me, and the University of London, St Bartholomew's Hospital, thought it was okay, so off I went, and a whole series of other serendipitous things happened. But on the way out, I dropped in to see Carol, who was in Austria at the time. Now, in my letters to Carol, who was, as I say, in this team of Operation Mobilization team in Krems, Austria at the time, I communicated about what I was beginning to experience and feel drawn and attracted to. Carol herself was certainly an enthusiastic Christian by this time, having had her own sort of desire, made her own commitment to Christ, to follow Jesus, and so was quite willing to consider Thailand as well. But anyway, I dropped in to see her at Krems on the way out. So it's just a brief picture to show you on my way out to Thailand. And then I resumed my journey. So here are a few photographs of the entrance of the University of Chiang Mai, top left, the moat and the old city walls of Chiang Mai, well-known tourist attraction. I stayed at the university with a student, sharing a room actually in their halls of residence. So I was thoroughly immersed in the sort of Thai student world there. I could understand a smattering of Thai, but had no fluency at that point. And what I discovered was that all the lectures were in Thai, as were the ward rounds and everything. So, and of course, it was interspersed with all the medical terms in English. I managed to kind of follow along, and with the help of reading books, textbooks, and things, and questioning the staff who spoke English quite fluently. I remember one of them was he'd been qualified from Edinburgh University, and he spoke with a Scottish Edinburgh accent, which is an interesting experience. But as I say, I joined in with all their activities, and one of them, I remember one night, one of the things that the students did on a particular Buddhist festival was to climb Doi Suthep, which is the sort of mountain that overlooks Chiang Mai. Those of you who've been to North Thailand and Chiang Mai will know that. And there you see a photograph taken from the temple at Doi Suthep. And we went up to the temple, and I remember we went up during the night, and then we sort of slept on the temple precincts. So I was with them in the Wat Suthep, which is, you picture there, the gold leaf covering the pagoda there. But anyway, during my time there, a series of interesting things also happened, which were more coincidences. Well, the coincidences coincidences involved actually, to start with, the five people on the three in particular, on the left. That's Prasan, Jarun, I think his name was, and Dick was Dick was his nickname. I can't remember his proper name. And then Chiang at the back there, and then one other person, I can't remember his name. But anyway, I had been, because of my enthusiasm to share the good news, I had begun sharing it with other students. And so we'd had some interesting conversations, particularly with Prasan on the left there. He was sort of showing some interest, another student. He wasn't a medical student, but Jarun was. Anyway, one day it was a Saturday, I went into town to do some shopping, and I got on the wrong bus. And when I realized I was on the wrong bus, I got off at a place called Changpur, which is the White Elephant Gate, to the east of Chiang Mai city, the square that's surrounded by the moat. And when I got off the bus to get on the right bus into the centre of town, Basan met me there. So I'm so glad I've met you, because I want to go to this camp, but I don't want to go on my own. I don't know anybody else in the camp. Would you go with me? It turned out that he'd been invited to go on a Christian camp run by, I can't remember which organisation. He could have been the Overseas Missionary Fellowship. I don't know, because that was the mission I ended up working with. But anyway, so I went with him that weekend, and he committed his life to following Jesus, and trusted in Jesus and all the rest of it, as one does in the evangelical way, and seemed very happy with all of that, and was curious, and we had more conversations about the Bible and stuff, and how to understand the Christian faith. And I mean, I had done a lot of Bible study myself, just out of curiosity at that point, trying to understand the scriptures for myself. But anyway, so shortly after this, they had their final exam. So the medical students all had done their first MB, the first part of their studies as a university course in their sort of science department, and then they moved across to the medical faculty. And in between the two, so this was after their final exams, getting their degree, the science degree first. They were having a discussion, because one of them had their very nice watch stolen, and they were discussing the question of why do good things happen to bad things happen to good people, because in Buddhism the sort of fundamental idea is if you do good you receive good, and you do evil you receive evil. So that's that's the law of karma, if you like. And yet it doesn't always work out that way. And so there was a philosophical discussion going on, and Jarun, the second man, picked up a book on the desk on which he was sitting. It was Prasan's room, and it happened to be a New Testament. He just said, "What's this?" and opened it out and started reading. And I don't know what it was that he picked out and read, but the next day he collared me and said, "Ken, the Bible's true," and told me about what had happened. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." So what happened is that Dick got involved too, and then Chiru, the other guy at the back, and we ended up forming a sort of discussion group. And then one day we all went up the Doi Suthep for a weekend retreat. And I've got another photograph I haven't shown here of us all there. The only bit of equipment, personal item that we'd taken was a toothbrush and a toothpaste. That was it. Tropical temperature, you don't need much more. The little hut we were staying in, it was warm enough. I think they provided us with some blankets there. And we slept on the floor and on bamboo mats, etc. And we spent the weekend discussing scripture. I remember we were looking at the book of Ephesians and all. I got quite enthusiastic talking about the letter of Paul to the Ephesians. Out of that, the group decided that they would form something, and what eventually turned out to be the Thai Christian Students Movement. It's an organisation which is now nationwide. So that was all a result of stuff that had happened to me in a serendipitous way, supported incidentally by a lecturer in surgery who was an Overseas Missionary Fellowship missionary, but had a post at the university as a lecturer. And when I left, of course, the group then met in his house, and that's how it continued.
It was only in the third year of our engagement, which was the final year of my medical studies, and Carol was down in London, so we saw a lot more of each other. And she was doing her PGCE, postgraduate certificate of education, to prepare to be a teacher, geography and RE. And then we decided that we'd get married. Actually, I decided I wanted to get married before I graduated because I couldn't face the idea of preparing for my final exams with all the sort of stress of getting ready for marriage. Whereas once we got married, which was on the 10th of July 1971, I felt I'd be much calmer, and that indeed was the case. Carol had already graduated from the Institute of Education, London University, and so the wedding took place at St John's Carluke up in Scotland. Most of it was arranged by her mother, but we had a lovely group of our friends at the wedding. And our reception, the photograph of me carrying Carol up the steps, was at the hotel in Biggar where we had our reception. So here we are, a newly qualified medic and a newly qualified teacher and a newly married couple. Looking back from the perspective of the process Enneagram that I've been relating this story to, we have arrived at point 4, which is where the principle of identity, independence, and selfhood comes into play. We have therefore arrived at that an adult person stage with a fully developed ego personality. Of course, neither of us had heard about personality types of any kind at that point. We later on got to know various different ways of testing and describing personality differences. And only much later did we come across the Enneagram, which is the one that made most sense to us. And I wish we had known back then, because it would have saved us an awful lot of misunderstanding and difficulties in our relationship. In point of fact, we only managed to, I think, stick together because both of us separately were committed followers of Jesus and committed, therefore, to the ideals of the Christian life and to a faithful relationship. But it required an awful lot of forgiveness.
I've already said something about my own ego personality, which I only really discovered many, many years later, and only began to understand the reasons for my behavior and feelings, or lack of them. And so I talked about this sort of scarcity mentality, this viewing the world as a place of scarcity, and therefore the need to conserve. But the number 5 personality classically is known as either the observer or the investigator. This kind of personality steps back from life and tries to think about it and make sense of it by withdrawing from the activity and observing from afar, rather than getting stuck in and engaged as some of for example, the number 8 personality does, or the number 3. So anyway, the other point about my personality is, as I said, I was a social dominant 5. That means that my social instinct was dominant.
The name that has been used to identify this particular subtype is specialist. Someone who likes to delve deeply into a particular area of knowledge or expertise and becomes a specialist in that area. So hardly surprising, I guess, that I have delved deeply into the whole topic of the Enneagram, and more specifically Gurdjieff's fourth way Enneagram, or the process Enneagram, which I'm beginning to use as a way of reflecting on my life. Anyway, here I am, quite a sort of withdrawn person, in order to need to conserve my energy, my emotional energy, my ways of thinking and understanding. And I meet this person who's a lovely, vivacious lady, young lady, who I'm very attracted to, and only later discover, we both later discover, that she's a classical self-preservation two. And now the number twos are always named as helpers because that's their sort of strength. They love to help people. They're also very empathetic. They can sense other people's feelings. But underneath that, the hidden and the dimension of that is the drive to, well, the desire, or rather the need to be needed. And that underneath that is the fact that instead of feeling totally and intimately connected with the ultimate reality of divine love, and also therefore part of the network of human relationships and connected to everybody, you need to actually acquire that, or you need to gain that sense of connection through helping other people. And that created a problem for me, because she was, I mean, looking back, she was wonderfully helpful and supportive of me indeed. But there were times when I felt I wanted to withdraw from that. So she was an outgoing type and I was the withdrawing type, and unable to cope with the sort of demands on my emotions, if you like, particularly the affectionate, and of course wanting to hear "I love you" very much more expressed verbally. My way of expressing it was to simply do stuff to help her, actually. The other thing about being a self-preservation too, which of course I'm not going into the detail of the description of these types, but the name that is some people attached to it, particularly Russ Hudson, is entitlement. And at a certain point in our marriage, that became an important factor. In other words, I've done this for you. I've gone along with your ideas and your vocation and calling. Now it's your turn to do something for me. So it's that sense of I'm entitled to that. So I'll talk about that maybe in a further episode. But what enabled us to stick together, if we hadn't both been committed followers of Jesus Christ and had the sort of container of the Christian ethos and worldview and way of thinking around us, I think we would have separated long before. So that was what held us together, a sort of sense of commitment that now we've made this decision, come what may, we must stick to it. So anyway, here we are. We've been married all these years and still together, which is in fact quite a miracle.
Well, I think that's a convenient point for me to at which to bring the second episode of the Memoirs of a Fellow Traveler to a close. In the next episode, I will be talking about my experiences in Thailand as a missionary, and how there were some fantastic, unusual experiences there as well. So I hope you'll find that interesting. So for now, bye-bye.